Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's training. This webinar is brought to you by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. Switchboard is funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. My name is Meg Gibbon and I'm Switchboard's Deputy Director. Our topic today is Ask an Expert, Creating Engaging Virtual Trainings and Meetings. I want to start by letting you know that today's training is being recorded and it will be transcribed. The recording will be sent to you via email from Zoom in 24 hours after today's training. Before diving into the content, I would like to take some time to familiarize ourselves with this Zoom platform, particularly because we will be talking quite a bit about using these features and other features like them in different platforms to engage participants in your own online events. So all participants are currently muted. We're expecting a very large group on the training today. But in the bottom left corner of your screen, you'll find the audio settings, which allows you to switch between the phone and the computer audio at any time. And then towards the bottom center of your screen, you'll see three tools, the first of which is chat. You can use chat to type out any comments that you have throughout today's session, responses to discussion questions, any concerns around technical issues, you can also type those there. If you send your message to all panelists and all attendees, everyone who is participating today will be able to see what you've written out. I am joined by my colleague, Rebecca Mulqueen, today, who will be providing tech support, and she will also be inserting links into the chat to all of the resources that we mentioned today. So you can monitor the chat to find those links also. You do have a raise hand icon in the very center of your screen on the bottom. At several points throughout today's training, we will ask you to raise your hand if you agree with a certain statement. And then when we get to our dedicated Q&A period a little bit later today, you can raise your hand if you'd like to request permission to unmute yourself and then ask a question aloud. The final tool that I want to flag for everyone is Q&A. This is an area where you can type in your questions and they will be visible to the entire group, and we will look at those as we get to, again, our Q&A period towards the end. You can also use the thumbs up icon to like or upvote a question that another participant has asked, and so we'll prioritize answering the questions that have the largest number of votes. If we don't get to your question today, we will also do our best to note it down and then follow up with you over email. All right, so I am so pleased to introduce three great panelists today. First, we have Kristy Gladfelter, Senior Director for Research Analysis and Learning at IRC. We'll also hear from Jamie Bussey, Deputy Director of Cultural Orientation Resource Exchange, or CORE, as well as from Sumita Chandrasekhar, Program Officer for Instructional Technology and Design, also at IRC. Sumita will be kicking us off, so over to you, Sumita.
Thanks so much, Meg. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. So here's a look at the learning objectives that we hope to achieve during our time. By the end of this webinar, you'll be able to consider various strategies for designing a strong virtual training or meeting, name collaboration tools that you can use to boost engagement during trainings and meetings, anticipate some common issues in virtual settings, and plan effective strategies for handling them. And then finally, after taking a closer look at some of the strategies and collaborative tools that we'll share for online engagement, our goal is for you to be able to walk away with at least one new idea that we've shared that you can incorporate into the design of a future virtual event. So we'll get started with a very quick poll. Coming into today's webinar, how would you rate your confidence level engaging participants in virtual meetings and trainings? Please go ahead and select a number on the scale, with 1 representing a low level of confidence and 5 representing a very high level of confidence. You can select your response in the poll pop-up window and then click Submit. I see a few responses coming in. I think a few people, actually quite a few people, would rate themselves right in the middle at 3. So again, our goal for today is to provide everyone, whether you have some experience delivering virtual sessions or if you have minimum experience delivering them, our goal is for everyone to walk away with at least a few tips and tools that you can utilize during your next session. So we'll get started with some strategies for designing a very strong virtual meeting or training with your participants. Some of these strategies are also a part of the methodology for planning for and running in-person meetings and trainings in a conventional setting, but there are some specific considerations that are particularly helpful to pay attention to when you design your session for a virtual delivery. So let's take a look at some of those strategies. So these are the ones that we're going to zoom in on today. The first is to know your audience. Also to set clear, specific objectives for your session, to prioritize interactions and engagements with your participants, to use your voice to engage the audience, to take advantage of your video capability, and also to craft questions that really promote engagement and interaction with your audience. So let's talk about the first strategy, which is know your audience. Identifying the composition of your audience is really a key factor in tailoring the design of your agenda. One of the essential questions to consider before facilitating an online session is, what are the current roles of your attendees? Answering this question will help you to develop the objectives for your meeting and also help to shape the types of interactive exercises that will have the most impact in your session. In parallel to that, another important question to consider when you're planning your agenda is, what does your audience know? So specifically, what knowledge and what types of skills from the audience are you building off of during your online event? If you have experts from the field that will be in attendance, you may want to consider how to best leverage their expertise during your discussions and other activities. For example, you could introduce a case study or a case scenario in your training and have an expert from the field lead an exchange on possible solutions, or perhaps provide specific input based on their experience. Another key consideration when planning your online event is to identify what potential technology limitations exist and then to plan accordingly. For staff, this can be accomplished through a brief survey that you can distribute ahead of the meeting or training session, asking them questions such as, do they have access to mics or to webcams and other hardware? For client-facing trainings, identifying technology gaps is especially crucial. It is a good idea to do a needs assessment, and some questions that you might want to consider in designing a needs assessment are, first, what is the client's literacy level? What are the client's digital abilities? Does the client have access to a smartphone, tablet, or a computer? Because the device will be key in determining what type of technology you want to use. Is the client able to access Wi-Fi or an internet connection for the online event? And then also, what language does the client speak? So we'll talk a little bit more about addressing these a little bit later in our session, but these are some questions that you might want to keep in mind in developing a needs assessment ahead of your virtual session. And then finally, another key component of knowing your audience is identifying what participants hope to get out of the session. For example, the Switchboard team provides an opportunity to participants to submit questions in advance of every webinar, and then to use those questions to help shape the content. So for example, for today's session, we saw during the registration process and questions that were being answered as part of that, we saw that there was a mix of interest from this audience in learning more about online delivery strategies for both client-facing trainings as well as staff-facing trainings. So we're going to aim to address both today. The second strategy to bear in mind is to set clear objectives for your online session. If you're looking to host an online training, articulating very specific learning objectives will help you to shape an effective agenda, also to keep participants engaged throughout this session, and then finally to better measure the session's success after. So you might want to first ask yourself, what should participants do before your online session to best prepare? Are there any brief reading materials or other supplemental content that they should familiarize themselves with beforehand? Or are there any questions for reflection that they should come to the meeting prepared with to discuss? By setting those expectations around participant preparation, you'll be better positioned to make the optimal use of your time together in the virtual collaborative collaborative setting, excuse me. It's also very helpful to identify how much time will be needed for each objective or for each topic that you'll cover in your session. Being very clear about your intended objectives will help to prioritize the time that's needed on the agenda to achieve them. Another thing to consider in a virtual meeting or training space is how attendees will interact with you as the presenter and with one another. So you might want to consider ahead of the session, do you want participants to unmute their mics to speak up when they have any questions that come up? Or will they type in their questions into the chat window so that those questions can be discussed and addressed towards the end of the meeting? Having a plan for how those interactions will be managed throughout the session and articulating them at the onset of your session will really help to ensure that you have a smooth set of interactions and engagement throughout the virtual session. And then finally, one of the other components of setting clear objectives for participants is to consider what the expected outcomes are of your virtual event. So it's very important to make your objectives as relevant and as action-driven as possible. Ask yourself, what would success look like at the end of the meeting or training? For trainings, it's particularly important to make evident the answer to the question, what will participants be able to do after the training? When creating your learning objectives, the focus should really be on what specific actions they'll be able to take after the meeting and how will they use the skills and knowledge that they've gained from the session. For example, there's a difference between an objective that is set around describing how to properly prepare a case file and having participants actually be able to put one together at the end of the session. So we'll share some resources at the end of this webinar around tools to craft effective learning objectives that are really action-oriented for participants. The next strategy is to prioritize interactions and engagement with your participants during your session. People retain information much better when they have an opportunity to interact. So aim to have a meaningful interaction at least every 4 to 5 minutes during your virtual session, which is the equivalent of every maybe 2 to 3 slides if you're using a presentation. And meaningful really means that you don't want to just facilitate an interaction for the sake of an interaction. The interaction or exercise or activity that you devise should serve the objectives that you've set forth. This is where being familiar with adult learning principles and student-centered learning design is extremely helpful. And we also have some resources that talk a little bit more about that for those who are interested in learning more. When designing interactions and other activities to engage with your virtual audience, timing is also very important to be accounted for. Interactions in a virtual space can take longer than if you were in an in-person meeting or training. So for example, you don't want to rush participants with inputting responses into the chat window. So if you ask a question and you just respond to the first 2 or 3 people who are typing into the chat, the rest of the participants may become quickly disengaged. So when you're planning your interactions and your other activities during your session, make sure to allow sufficient time for participants to reflect and respond. So just a quick, by show of hands, let us know, raise your hand, if this statement has been true for you. If you've participated in a virtual meeting or a training session where the presenter had limited interactions with the audience. Have you ever been in a session like that? So when our sessions, are not filled with interactions, participants can disengage, they might multitask and not place their main focus on the content that's being delivered. So it's really important to be mindful of weaving in meaningful interactions throughout your session. Another tool to maintain engagement with your audience is to use your voice. So since the primary focus in a virtual setting will be on your voice. It's important to pay particular attention to your tone and to use your voice as a vehicle to convey enthusiasm for the subject matter. And that will help participants to better engage with the content that's being delivered. Clarity is also key. To ensure optimal clarity for your voice, it's extremely important to test the mic that you'll be using in your session ahead of time to ensure that it functions properly and that there's no echo or any other feedback that could interfere with the audience's ability to hear you clearly. Another strategy that is available to us when working in an online setting is video. Whenever bandwidth allows, video can be a very important tool to increase engagement. At a minimum, presenters should be on video. So that's what we're doing in our session here. Beyond just seeing each other's faces, you can also use video as a tool to give virtual tours of a workspace or a program space. So think of the ways that you can use video creatively to showcase different things in your event. When you are using video, just a couple of key things to pay particular attention to. One, you want to make sure that your lighting is tested beforehand to just make sure there's not too much soft or harsh light that's distracting. We also want to make sure that there's nothing distracting about your background setting. Also, be sure to secure a location to facilitate your meeting or your training that has minimal background noise. Overall, using video will give your webinar or meeting a personal feel, and it will allow the audience to better engage with your speakers. So quick raise of hands again. Let us know if this statement is true for you. I've had challenges with participants not responding to questions in meetings. Have you ever asked a question of your audience and just not heard anything as a response? So this is another common challenge that we've often encountered in virtual settings. And again, because you're not able to observe body language and other behavior like you would in an in-person training, it's really important when you're designing your virtual session, whether it's a meeting or a training, to craft questions that really promote engagement with your audience. So questions should be very clear, they should be very targeted, and they should be direct. It's also helpful in a virtual setting to not ask too many questions at once, because you want participants to really focus at the question at hand and have time to reflect and respond in whatever mechanism you're utilizing, whether it's the chat box or if you're having them speak up. Closed-ended questions, which are questions with very specific answers, such as yes, no, will often receive more responses. So we found that to be a helpful way of constructing your questions to get more responses. If you do want to ask a more open-ended question of your participants, it's helpful to be very specific and have participants write their responses in the chat, again, to give them a little bit more time to respond. And oftentimes, when one participant sees the response of another participant, it will lead to that exchange amongst colleagues who are in the session together. As the facilitator, be very comfortable with a pause. So again, if you do ask a question and it still takes a few moments for you to see responses come through the chat, for people to raise hands in a session and respond, allow enough of a pause so that people can type in their thoughts, reflect more deeply, and share out just like in a classroom. Set the expectation of engagement early on in your session as well. Once you lose a participant, it's a lot harder to re-engage. One way to ensure maximum engagement from everyone in larger groups, so if you have a larger meeting or a larger session of training, it's often helpful to have them raise a virtual hand for instant feedback to a question or statement. We're also going to talk in just a few moments a little bit more about specific online collaborative tools that will help serve that purpose as well. And then finally, rather than saying, "Are there any questions?" which will likely lead to silence from your audience, you can make it very clear from the start of the session that participants should write their questions throughout the presentation as they come up and let them know when they'll be answered. That way people will remain engaged, and if a question comes up at one point about an earlier topic, they know they have the space to share that. If you aren't able to go through all of the questions, a helpful tip is to create a Q&A document after the event that you can share out with participants so that you know you have enough time to address everything.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for spending an hour with us today. We're going to address some of the questions you sent with your registration now. And the most popular by far was, how can we keep participants engaged and make the training or the meeting interactive? And because everyone on this session is probably using different technology in your workplace, we're not going to walk through specifics of the different platforms, but instead we're going to focus on how you can use common collaboration tools on most meeting platforms to boost engagement. And to learn more about specifics on how they work with the platform that you're using, we suggest that you review the help documentation or the online support for whatever the system that you're using. At the beginning of this webinar, we used a poll to gauge how experienced participants feel they are with virtual trainings and meetings. And polls are a really great way of letting people rate a topic. They're also good for voting on a priority or a preference. So for example, you may have more than one direction that you could go in for a meeting or a training, and you can use participant feedback through a poll to let them decide which way they want to go and what they want to discuss next. They can also be used to quiz participants, and you can share the final results while still keeping individual answers hidden. Note that some platforms, in some of the platforms, polls only allow for one user, and in others you can check all that apply. You can use the polling feature as a gaming tool. So as we know, games are popular with adult learners, not just children. But you could also disperse questions throughout a webinar or a meeting as a game that participants can fully complete throughout your session. When you present a training or a hosting or a meeting online, or you're hosting a meeting online, especially when the group is quite large and it's too large to have video for all participants, it's really hard to tell how the participants are feeling. And you can sometimes feel like you're talking to a wall. But emojis and other nonverbal reactions such as thumbs ups can be used by participants to communicate to the presenter. And you can use these as quite a quick temperature check to see how people are doing. They can also be used for participants to express appreciation with applause or laughter, or ask a presenter to slow down or speed up, or let you know that they need a coffee break. And some platforms, they also have a way that you can let a presenter know if you need to walk away. This is especially helpful for small groups and in meetings. And while nothing can fully replace seeing your participant's face in person, the tools can go a long way to help you have an idea of how people are feeling and how they're engaging with the session. Okay. Another useful feature is the chat box, and we've used this a little bit today. I've noticed a few people communicating in the chat. When you have a large group, as we do today, it's usually not possible to have participants share verbally during the session. Webinar chats can present an opportunity to cover material more efficiently, actually, than is possible in an in-person meeting in some cases. So when you're face-to-face, for example, I'm sure many of you had workshops where you spend some time introducing the participants, and that can take quite a long time. One advantage of the virtual world is that you can have everyone introduce themselves simultaneously. You can also use a chat feature to have everyone give feedback on what's being discussed, and you can have them share personal experiences. When you have large groups like this, it's best to ask for short responses that can be scanned fairly quickly. But in smaller groups, you can use the chat for people to describe in more detail their challenges, or even share case studies that could be discussed. It is important, and Sumita touched on this, it's important to ask and expect participants to engage in the chat. I think someone wrote in the chat that, what do you do when people don't engage back with you? I think if you ask a question and only 20% respond or less, it's really hard to know if the question wasn't clear, if people don't have an answer, or if they're just not engaged in your presentation. So one way to avoid this is to make it very clear from the start that all participants should respond in some way or another to the questions. And even if that answer is, I don't know. Just as you would if you were in a classroom, right? A teacher would, if a teacher asks a question, you're not going to just look at them. In the virtual world, that's what it feels like when people don't use the chat. So making that expectation from the beginning of participants will really help to make sure people stay engaged. And then finally, in face-to-face settings, interactions between participants are often very important for them to build rapport and trust. And in the virtual world, this chat box can be that way that people can engage both with the facilitators and with each other. So I'd like you to take 10 seconds, and I'm going to demonstrate that it's fine to have seconds of silence to write your answer to this question in the chat. And if you don't have worries about virtual meetings or trainings, congratulations, and it's fine to let us know that as well. If you share concerns that you see others are writing about, let them know that as well. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to do this. Great, thank you please feel free to keep sharing those things that are keeping you up at night. I was looking through and I noticed technology was a big issue that keeps all of us up at night. And Jamie is going to talk next about what are some things you can do to avoid, what you can do to address some of the issues that happen. The issues are always going to happen, so it's a matter of how you address them. The next feature we want to talk about is the whiteboard, and you can use this tool to have participants type, draw, or stamp on presentation slides or on a separate blank screen. This is a great tool for small meetings and trainings. When you have a small group, you can use it much like you would if you were using flip charts in an in-person workshop. So as you're converting from in-person to online, think about how you would normally use that in a workshop, and then is there a way that you can use that virtually? In a large group like this, we can't demonstrate it. It's not possible, just as it wouldn't be possible to have 100 people or 322 people writing on the same flip chart, right? But in a small group, it is very useful. And I'm going to show you a few examples of whiteboard activities that you might find useful for your meetings. The first is an icebreaker. You may have seen this. This is a pretty common one, where to get people warmed up in the beginning, you can share a map of locations. This is US map. You could do a world map, and people can place an arrow on where they work or where they're from, or they can stamp it or draw on the map as well. You can also use annotation tools on the next slide to have people point to a problem. In this example, participants are pointing out security issues in an operating room. So if in a normal face-to-face situation, you would have people point to a problem or demonstrate something, you might be able to do that with using images or clip art and having people point to what they think is off or highlighting a specific part of an image. You can also use a whiteboard to group people by categories. So in this example, participants write their name under the time frame that they've worked at the organization or in the field. And this is a helpful way to group participants by specific characteristics or interests, and it lets them group themselves. Another fun icebreaker and a way to get participants used to using annotation tools, because a lot of it is also about giving the participants an opportunity to feel comfortable on the platform. You can ask them to draw their favorite animal, their favorite food or activity, and then as they're sharing something about themselves in their introductions, they can also describe what they drew and why they drew it. And these type of creative activities where you're using drawing tools can be a great lighthearted way to start a meeting or a webinar. Sumita talked about the importance of presenters using video, but you can also use video as a way to engage participants through an activity. So in this example, to lead an interactive discussion, you can ask participants to turn on or off their video depending on whether they agree with the statement. So in a recent meeting that I held, I asked this, I said this statement: COVID-19 has made concentrating on my work very difficult. And those who agreed with the statement kept their videos on. Those who disagreed turned their videos off. And those who kept their videos on then engaged in a conversation to kind of dig a little bit deeper. What is it that makes you have a hard time concentrating? And then at the end, everyone turned their video on and we were able to have a group discussion. This really allowed us to have more short, targeted conversations and to be able to hear from everyone in the meeting. This technique can work really well for meetings where you need to discuss opposing viewpoints or if you need to find common ground for controversial issues. And there are other ways to use multimedia online. You can show short videos, animations, you could explore a website together, you can do a demo of software as well. And sharing multimedia is a really good way to break up speakers' speaking points, and it can be useful for hands-on, things that you need to do hands-on, like a website or a software demo. We did receive a few questions on specifically this topic, and including on how virtual training can be used in extremely hands-on program contexts like farming and agricultural programs. So we wanted to use that as an example and briefly share for a few seconds an Arabic language video created by the IRC in Sacramento's New Roads program, and that was designed to train clients on food safety.
من أسهل الأشياء التي يمكنك القيام بها هي غسل يديك. هناك عدة مرات في اليوم يجب عليك القيام بذلك. قبل البدء في العمل كل يوم، قبل دخول المنطقة ليتم حصادها، قبل ارتداء القفازات إذا كنت تستخدمها.
Great, we just wanted to show you just a little bit to show you how it can work. It is really important that you've tested your equipment. I can guarantee you we tested this many times before today's webinar to make sure that your media is going to work, that it's set up and queued properly. We also want to keep it short in length so you can keep everyone's attention. And we'll talk about technology challenges and how to prepare for them in the next session. And before we do that though, I wanted to briefly mention two other commonly available tools that we use on these platforms. Some systems such as Zoom allow you to use a Q&A feature, which we're using today and we'll be referring to at the end. In this feature, attendees can submit their questions and then you can have a forum where it's moderated and as people's questions are answered, you can note that. In some cases, if it's public Q&A, you can allow the participants to answer each other's questions. And you can also, in some features, upvote a question. So if it's a question that really resonates with you, you can vote for it. And then you can concentrate on the questions with the most votes to address in your webinar. And then the final feature is the breakout rooms that you might want to consider these for virtual trainings and especially for meetings. They can be used much like you would use small groups if you were in a workshop session. They're great for brainstorming, problem solving, case studies. And as the meeting host, you can split the participants into these rooms automatically or manually, and you can switch between rooms anytime. You can drop in and out of the small groups just like you would if you were in person and you were walking around a conference to moderate small group discussions. You can do that as well online virtually by dropping into the different rooms. One advantage of the virtual platform to the physical or to the in-person platform is you can actually bring people back instantaneously. So you don't have to go out and call everyone to come back to plenary, but you can do that with one click of a button. Before you use this tool though, I highly recommend that you practice the mechanics of it. It is a little difficult at first. So you want to practice how do you separate participants, how do you bring them back to plenary, how do you provide facilitation in the small groups. So you would need to have a couple people to help you practice that, but it is a very useful tool. Knowing your audience, very important. Breakout rooms are not necessarily a good fit for very large audiences, but again, it can be very useful if you want to do some brainstorming in small groups. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to talk about technology.
Thanks, Kristy. So how can we prevent technology issues? And I know in particular, before when you were registering for this session, there was a lot of questions around digital literacy and different literacy abilities with participants. So we're going to focus on that a little bit. But I first want to have a question. I have a question for everybody there. If you can raise your hand, if you consider yourself tech savvy. So just raise a hand for those who consider themselves tech savvy. So I see Linda, Karsten, Stacy, Peyton, Mark, Rachel, Matt, Julie. Great. There's over 100 of you who consider yourselves tech savvy. Now I'd like to now see a show of hands of those who have encountered challenges with technology maybe in the last week or two. How many of you have faced challenges with technology? So good. I see Kendra, Tiffany, Lydia, Adam. Good. Now there's more people. There's over 130 people who have challenges with technology. So really, in just this very quick show of hands, you are demonstrating the representation of what you will encounter when you're running your own sessions or even participating in sessions, which is that you will have inevitably a mixture of levels of experience with technology, and you will generally encounter challenges with technology. So what we're gonna look at is what you can do to mitigate and help yourself prepare as best as you can with preventing technology. So to start, what you're really wanting to do, and I see a lot of questions coming in the Q&A, and I saw a lot of concerns in the chat box about different literacy, digital literacy abilities. So you wanna make sure the first step you do is determine if technology is really right for your audience. So this goes back to the point that Sumita made at the very beginning of the session, which is remember to know your audience. So recently at CORE, we conducted a webinar around remote cultural orientation. And what we did in that is we asked participants to think through different questions. And these are some of the questions that Sumita highlighted as well, which is what are their literacy levels? What languages do they speak? What are their digital abilities? And I think knowing your audience in many ways is like conducting your own needs assessment. As Sumita said, what are their skills? What are their knowledge? And you want to really ask, is the virtual space really the best option? And what are the alternatives? So for instance, if someone is not digitally literate and they're also not literate, is a phone call maybe a more appropriate mechanism? Also, could there be coaching on the phone doing that phone call? Perhaps there is some digital literacy. Would an email be better? Would text messaging? So really looking at the different options available to you. The other thing to consider is when working particularly with clients is the role of interpretation and translation. So if you are going to use a virtual space, and I see this noted in the chat boxes, thinking through what is involved with providing that interpretation. So then that adds another layer, because it's not only the participant, but you also have to make sure your interpreters are prepared to use that technology as well. The other piece of knowing your audience is to take into consideration security. Is it appropriate to use the platform for the discussion and sharing information without putting the participants at risk? So there's a lot of different platforms. As we mentioned, we're not going to go into all the details, but when you're looking at platforms, each of them have different security levels. So for example, we're using Zoom today. Blue Jeans is another platform, and most of these have similar tools, as Kristy was pointing out, but they also have different securities in them. So for example, at CORE, we work with a lot of people based in Europe, and all of those systems required to be GDPR compliant. So those are the types of things that you want to be aware of. So if you have assessed your audience and you feel confident that the virtual space is really still the best space, what do you do next? So the next part of this is really accommodating your audience's digital abilities. And to do this, you want to make sure you're looking at the strengths that the individuals bring. Make sure that what you're doing with the technology is relevant and you're maintaining time, and then you provide clear instructions. Now, when we talk about a strengths-based approach, I often ask this question, which is, just because someone is not literate, does it mean they don't have digital literacy? And I always give this example in workshops. We once heard about this case of Burmese women in Colorado, refugees that were resettled, who were not literate, spoke very little English, but they knew how to use their smartphones. They knew how to use them for social media, and they knew how to use them to get to different places in the community. So people are really quite resilient with technology. So you want to come from a strengths-based perspective, but balance that with realistic expectations. So being aware of what technology the participants are used to. More and more what we're seeing, particularly with the clients that we're serving, is that they're more connected and they're more comfortable with smartphones, for example. So a show of hands, I'd like to know if you use a iPhone typically, if that's the typical phone that you use. So I'm seeing we have Aspen, Joseline, Elizabeth, Samuel, Colleen, Sierra. There's about 100 of you who use iPhones. Now, who here uses a Android? Can I have a show of hands of those of you who use Androids? Great. So presumably the second half of the group who's not using iPhones, although there may be some of you have both Androids and iPhones. So this is a really great example that even within this group, we have two different types of users. Now, I am an iPhone user. I am not proficient at Androids. So when we've worked with doing trainings with technology, we take that into consideration. Even how different platforms function on an iPhone, different web browsers, those are the types of things you want to think through. And I see that in a lot of the questions you're asking is, oh, how would you do an interaction, for example, with someone who's on the phone on Zoom versus being on the laptop? And it does change. So you want to keep those things in mind when you're looking at how you deliver those interactions. Another example of this is today we're using Zoom, and Zoom has what's called Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars. This is actually the first time I've used Zoom webinars, so that was a bit of a learning curve for me as well. So the features are different. So going back to what Kristy said, once you have a platform, really going in there and testing out and looking at what is available through those different platforms. The last thing I'll say with the digital literacy with clients is that something that might be useful is CORE has developed a digital awareness assessment. It's very basic and it's something that can help you gauge where clients are in their comfort with digital technology. Digital literacy and teaching digital literacy is a whole field upon itself and a bigger conversation. And so if that's something that you're wanting to incorporate into your programming, that would be a different conversation. So the other pieces of this, as I mentioned with the audience, is maintaining time, keeping things relevant. So this applies to both content and how it's delivered. So you want to be patient and allocate the extra time needed to explain platforms. And this is regardless of who you're working with. So you want to make sure that you also are taking into account cognitive overload. Is it too many things to teach someone to do all those different settings, plus you're trying to teach them a new concept at the same time? As Sumita said, you also want to provide clear instructions. So this all is pointing to this bigger piece of things, which we just saw on the next slide, which is you need to thoroughly prepare ahead of time. So this is not just preparing yourself, but also preparing those that you're working with and testing the equipment ahead of time. So audio is really key with this, as we've pointed out. So I want to see a raise of hand of how many of you have been on a call where there's background noise. Yeah, I'm seeing we're over 100 already. So there's many of you have been on calls where there's background noise. So really, audio is pretty key. And you, on one hand, if you have a smaller group, you want to consider how you're going to use audio and encourage engagement. But on a call like today where we have over 300 people, you want to keep people muted so that the tension of the information being conveyed is not lost. So you have to balance those two things. The other thing when you're preparing is the Wi-Fi and internet connection and having contingency plans. And so this is something that's also important, is that if you are working with individuals who are maybe don't have strong internet connection, again, is technology really the best option for them to connect on Zoom? Or can you give them dial-in information? And if they are going to dial in, then consider, okay, what will be the interactions I'll use? Do I need to rely more on chat or people being able to mute and unmute themselves? So thinking through those items. Oftentimes you'll spend more time preparing and doing practice runs than actually leading the session itself. As Kristy mentioned, we practiced this session and went through these different pieces multiple times. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions. The last thing in terms of planning is making sure you're preparing your presenters, and you're also preparing your participants. And I think Sumita really hit on this quite a bit earlier in terms of making sure you have clear instructions, visuals. You saw at the beginning of the session, we showed where the different components of the raise your hand feature and those different things were on this platform. So the last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for the last 15 minutes or so, is that no matter what you do, there's going to be challenges with technology. And so you want to make sure that you don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And this is something that despite everything that you do, there will be challenges. There may be items that go wrong, and that a part of that is your own learning experience using these tools and working in virtual environments. And I'm going to turn it over to Meg if she wants to add any more. I know this was, you had some really great examples of this.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And I will be brief here because we do want to make sure we take time for live questions in addition to some of these questions that we've been walking through that we received at pre-registration. For me, this is my stump speech. If you all are familiar with Switchboard, you might have heard my voice before and know that I'm involved with delivering a number of trainings. And I think it's key to remember that despite best efforts, it is possible that something may go wrong. So to give you a few examples, some things I and my colleagues have had happen include a power outage that took down an entire city block and cut off the speakers into internet and audio completely. Of course, we always have the classic, everything goes well during testing with the connection, and in the exact same setup again, something happens with the speaker's audio and there's background noise. You know, I've had all kinds of chaos come when we had people unmuted who should have been muted and so on, right? And my attitude tends to be that once you get through those kind of things, or once you know that those things happen to everyone, what's the worst that really can happen? You know, you get through that and you move on. So I think it's key to have a sense of humor, stay calm. If you become flustered, those situations can seem worse than they really are. And, you know, there are always solutions, right? You always have the ability to follow up over email. If there were things you couldn't get to during the session, you can always reschedule. If you have a catastrophic failure, really, if a speaker is sick and you have to cancel, that's not the end of the world. And so learning from the issue for next time is always key. We're here training you all on how to do training and engaging meetings, but we are also seeking ourselves always to improve. So you've heard me likely, or you will hear me plug our feedback survey towards the end of the session today. That's a great way to get people's feedback on how can you improve, what can you learn from and do better next time. You know, having that be the goal rather than be perfect every single iteration. So with that, we will move into live Q&A. And so there were several questions that we received. You know, really, I saw that the chat box, the Q&A was very active. So I'm going to go straight to the top of the Q&A. So, and this one I think I will direct to Jamie, given the focus CORE has placed lately on the distinction between calling in for telephone CO and accessing CO online. So how do you engage those who are calling in, like you may have mentioned earlier, versus those who are accessing the webinar or the online meeting with their computer?
Yeah, so I think knowing ahead of time how many people may be calling in will be really helpful, so you don't plan a lot of interactions that involve annotation items so that they can still participate. So the other thing I would say with this is knowing the number of people that are on the call. So if you're doing a meeting, let's say it's 10 people and you know half of them are going to be on the call, designing it so that you're really encouraging a discussion and conversation. And that goes back to what Sumita mentioned at the beginning, which is how you design your questions and making them very clear. The other thing that we've done when we've led different trainings or webinars where we know there's people on the phone and the chat box is heavily used, is as a facilitator being comfortable reading what's in the chat box and reiterating what's being said on the screen or seen on the screen, so that those who are on the call are able to participate. So for instance, today we had that. Yesterday we actually had a session where somebody was on the phone and they weren't able to annotate. So we also gave them options of putting their answer in the chat box. So it's, again, it goes back to knowing the audience and what they're going to be doing, and then also creating an environment where they feel comfortable to mute and unmute themselves if it's a smaller group. If the interaction is super important, that they be able to annotate and be able to see the screen, I think Sumita mentioned this earlier on, is setting the expectations with the participants ahead of time. And something that we've done when we have that that occurs, we actually do, like today we did like a 30-minute pre-session to just go over how to use Zoom before we did a longer training, so that people weren't distracted by, oh, this is my first time doing Zoom and I'm also trying to learn this content. So providing a lot of preparation ahead of time if you are going to use those features.
Great, thank you, Jamie. I want to direct the next question to Kristy, who mentioned gamification. I know a very hot topic in learning. Can you talk a little bit more about how you could use polling to gamify a meeting or training?
Sure, and I will say on certain platforms, they do have a quiz feature that you could also use, but even a simple poll can be used as a quiz. So if you come up with 4 or 5 questions, for example, in a training, and you disperse those questions as a multiple choice poll question, then you can have people, for example, you put up the poll, you ask the question, you give them the answer, and they, just to make it a little easier to facilitate, they keep track of the points, right? And at the end, you can see how many each participant got right. So there are ways you can track that as well, but as a facilitator, it's probably easier for something like this that's lighthearted. You don't need it for the meeting itself, is just to have people keep track of their scoring. So that's one way, that would be an easy way to implement that. So think about what are the questions, what are the knowledge questions that you have in a training, and how can I make those multiple choice and disperse those throughout the training. If you have a meeting, you might just do something trivia. How about some history lesson on your organization, and to keep people engaged, or some trivia topics related to whatever the meeting topic it is, and using that poll as a multiple choice quiz question that you can use throughout.
Great, thank you for that. A few questions I saw on what's being sent out for resources. Yes, to the question on, is the digital assessment, digital abilities assessment developed by CORE among those resources that you'll receive over email? It is. Rebecca will also drop the link to that in the chat shortly. Reading through some of the other questions we've received, and this one maybe I'll answer because I was involved with this in this particular case. We had a question around, how do you divide responsibilities among facilitators? How can you split tasks during the training, such as answering questions, sharing video, polling, sharing screens, etc.? I think the question can be answered in a lot of different ways, but this really depends on how many people you have at your disposal, the size of your event, and how easy your technology is to use. One thing I can acknowledge based on several of the questions that we received and typed out answers to is that many people have different questions about how to manage a platform, whether it be Zoom, BlueJeans, WebEx, GoToMeeting. I'm sure there are many others I'm not aware of. If you become familiar with your platform, you get a sense of what's the easiest thing to do, have one person do, have 2 people do, have 3 people do, and then balance that, the ease of use with what's realistic and what you actually have capacity for. So if you're feeling like you would like to do a training that would involve all types of interaction and different features, but you don't have the number of staff that would make that possible in a way that will not cause distraction or disruption for the attendees, it might be worth simplifying what you're after. So I think that's really the balance, is finding out through experience what works, and making sure you match your expectations with what is realistic. We're fortunate for Switchboard to have the ability to have more than 1 staff on a training at a certain time, which works well for larger groups. For a session that is 20 or 30 people, we typically would only have maybe 1 staff person as the host plus the speaker, unless that session was very complicated and had a lot of breakout rooms or annotation, in which case we might add a 3rd. So I hope that answers that question. I see that we have a number of questions that are tied in terms of votes, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for wrap up, but I do see a question here that I think Sumita could speak to. Could you provide a little bit more detail on how to really write an engaging discussion question?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of going back to some of what we covered earlier in this session, when crafting a question, depending on what you want to get the most meaningful response for you as well, right, during that interaction as the facilitator, it's really important to be very specific. So maybe using content that you've shared during your presentation as a jumpstart to that discussion question. So maybe you've shared out learning on a key topic, maybe you've reviewed a case scenario, then you might want to craft a question around that that's, again, specific to, you've just had a chance to read this case scenario. What is one challenge that you've experienced that's similar to that? And just kind of hone in on specifically what you'd like to get out of the participant in terms of what their experience has been. So I think questions that tap into people's experience, their prior knowledge, and again, that may jumpstart out of content that you've specifically woven into your presentation are great context from where to develop meaningful questions. And again, going to some of the resources that will be shared shortly or after the session, we also have some guidance on objectives, and kind of matching your discussion questions to those objectives can also be a helpful tool when developing questions.
Great, thank you, Sumita. I'm going to navigate now to our resources slide, and that will highlight, I think, some of the things you can expect over email, and that you'll also be able to pull from the chat. So to quickly run through what we are making available, of course, there are many, many other resources they might be interested in. So if you do have specific questions that you're feeling like these don't answer, reach out to us. But as Sumita mentioned, we are sharing a document, a very basic introduction on writing effective learning objectives. Several materials from course, so remote cultural orientation guidance, adult learning and student-centered learning, infographics to provide an introduction to that topic. We'll also include the digital abilities assessment. Rebecca has been answering so far several questions comparing different platforms. You can find those in the Q&A under the answered column. One tool to compare different platforms, if that's really of interest, is something that was recently put together by National Network to End Domestic Violence, and so we will share that chart. Just pulls out a few. Again, the possibilities are really limitless as far as platforms go, but that one is maybe more useful for those of you who have HIPAA or confidentiality or security concerns, because that's a big emphasis in that document. And then we have a final question around interpretation that I've seen here from Victoria. We had 6 others who also voted on that, around the best way of addressing language barriers and figuring out how to navigate interpretation in a virtual setting. I think this could certainly be a training on its own that we don't have time to get into in detail, but we have just published today a blog on the Switchboard website written by an interpreter with experience in refugee resettlement contexts abroad and in the US on getting started with remote video interpreting. And so I do hope that that blog post, which the link is now in the chat and you'll get it over email via Zoom, goes into detail on answering that particular question. Again, does depend on your platform, but there are a few specific considerations for getting started there. All right, I see we are drawing towards the end of our time. Because we are hoping that by the end of today, you'll be walking away with at least one idea to engage participants in your next virtual training or meeting, I'm just going to open a final poll to let us know what is of interest to you, what you think you might try. So as you fill out that poll, I'll also say thank you to all of our speakers for facilitating today, for all of our participants for your active engagement throughout, for participating in all of these interactions that we tried, and then currently now thinking through what you might do for the next time. I can see there's a big mix of responses here. I'm sure different things are of interest to different people based on your needs, and I'll go ahead and close that poll and share those results so you can see what your colleagues were most interested in. A final plug here to stay in touch with Switchboard. You have, if you're an OER-funded organization, Switchboard Technical Assistance is available to you. So that means support with answering your questions. providing recommended resources, sharing things that we've been hearing from others who might be in the same position. I know we're all facing all kinds of new challenges right now, and so we are doing our best to match up different expertise with some of those emerging needs. You have our contact information here, so please do not hesitate to be in touch with us. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you had questions that we didn't get to, we will try to follow up with you over email. And then finally, I would really appreciate it, and the whole team would appreciate it, if you could take some time to fill out our feedback survey. You'll see that pop up at your screen once you exit this webinar, or it may also already be open depending on how you joined the training today. That survey is incredibly important for us in understanding how well the training went, in your opinion, whether we achieved our learning objectives that we set out, what we can do to improve for next time, kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap up this session. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today, and a huge thank you to all of our panelists, as well as Rebecca for her tech support during the meeting. If you would like to be in touch with Switchboard, you can find us at www.switchboardta.org, or you can email us at switchboard@rescue.org. Thank you, everyone.